That's why it's REG rather than RNG. Same thing though. So you can put this random number generator into, say, a concert hall, and at times where the music is particularly engaging and the audience is quite enthralled with it, the sequence of bits tends to deviate farther from randomness. It seems to show some sort of coherence at these points in time. And afterwards, the experimenter, for example, can compare the randomness as a function of time and compare it to the concert. And perhaps one might even have people in the concert writing down at various times where they found the music to be particularly engaging. And there are some studies where this was done at a baseball game and in a movie theater and so on. And you really do see some sort of effect which apparently shows some sort of a collective effect from multiple people being engaged in something.
I understand that correspondingly to that, there's also experiments when they put the REG in a situation where it was like a business meeting where people were generally not engaged or thinking about different things, and there wasn't much departure from entropy or randomness.
Right. It would be interesting to take this and put it in university classrooms. I think a lot of professors would be quite insulted to find that students were not engaged during much of the
Not
lecture.
your classes, I'm sure.
I hope not.
And so that eventually led to the idea that, perhaps we could gauge the collective shifts in attention of the entire population.
Right. This has been used over the years, and Roger Nelson and his associates have looked at this data. And typically, the way that they analyze the data is they think of some event at which they think there should be some attention paid by a large fraction of the world. For example, during Academy Award ceremonies, and then look for some deviation for all of these signals that have been collected from around the world. Look for deviations in those signals from randomness during these events. They have found that there are statistically significant deviations. They've then looked at other events that occurred unexpectedly. For example, the death of Princess Di, or another one that gave them the biggest effect was the 9/11 bombings. So these effects were then post hoc analyzed, that is, after the fact, analyzed to see if there were deviations from randomness. And they found significant deviations, and the more impactful the event was, the larger the deviations were. All of this data is available on the website of the Global Consciousness Project. And so if you think they've been cherry picking or selective in their data analysis, you can go in and do the analysis yourself to make sure that they're doing it honestly.
I think they've got quite a strict criteria for what counts as an event and what counts as something that we might expect to see an effect. And as you say, the 9/11 event was precisely the kind of event that you would expect this to be the kind of archetypal occasion for this network of REGs all around the planet to respond. And in fact, that is exactly what they saw. I think Dean Radin carried out an independent analysis and found that the RNGs had a higher intercorrelation value on that day than any other day that year. And intercorrelation here meaning that the RNGs were acting in a far more synchronized way than usual. And of course, they're not actually connected to each other, although they do send all of their data back to Princeton.
Right. And if you look at this data with any degree of objectivity, I think it's hard to say that there's nothing there. There really is an effect. Roger Nelson worked with a colleague, Peter Bancel, for a number of years, who did statistical analysis along with him to make sure that this really did show what in fact it was purported to show. And there is definitely an effect. However, I have an argument against the conventional view of this, and I'm not convinced that it shows exactly what Roger thinks it does.
Exactly. So before we jump into that, what is, I guess, the traditional interpretation of the Global Consciousness Project? Perhaps I can summarize it and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But so, in some fashion, mind introduces order into the world in a way that is not currently understood or explained in conventional thinking about minds. And yet, there seems to be a participation between our minds and the world. And the introduction of this order is what these instruments are picking up. And so, at a global level, just as you say, collective shifts in thought or resonant peaks of attention ought to affect a network of these devices all around the planet. But you have a different interpretation to all this, right?
Right. And this gets into a whole new area. So there is one phenomenon that has been found virtually everywhere in psi research. And this ubiquitous effect is called the experimenter effect.
Mm.
When one carries out a psi experiment, one would like to have, say, the subjects control a random number generator, or the subjects be involved in a particular telepathic or precognitive process. However, there is not only the intention of the subject that is in operation, but also the experimenter. And so the experimenter tends to have a very significant and sometimes even dominant effect on the results of the experiment. This leads to the very difficult situation that people who want to run an experiment but are dead set in believing that psi does not exist tend to get null results because their intention, presumably, is to show that there's nothing there, and that's borne out. And as you might expect, if you were to design how psi worked, you'd expect there to be an experimenter effect, and so there is. And so some experimenters tend to get positive results almost all the time, and some tend to get poor results. Also, as the experimenter's attitude changes, the results can change. And this has been shown not only in individual experiments, but even in experiments in which a skeptic and a proponent alternatively directed a particular experiment. And the proponent got positive results, the skeptic got null results. So it's observed all the time. The question then comes as to how this might affect the Global Consciousness Project. And several people have said that they believe there's a strong experimenter effect. One of the earlier people to say this was Helmut Schmidt, the same person who developed the electronic random number generator for psi experiments. And so before he died, he wrote a letter to the Journal of Scientific Exploration saying, wait a minute, this effect, this global consciousness, has all of the characteristics of an experimenter effect in which Roger Nelson is seeing what he expects. And so how do we know that there is a global consciousness that's really directing what's happening? Then, over the last few years, Roger's associate, Peter Bancel, has published several papers in which he's analyzed this to great depth. And one of the characteristics of the experiment that he brings up is the mode of operation for these electronic random number generators. So if you go back to what we were saying a little bit earlier in this conversation, what you see as an output from the electronic random number generator is not the pure effect of the random process. In fact, it has been manipulated by the logical XOR gate
Right.
that produces then an equal number of zeros and ones. And so what Peter Bancel said is that If it were simply some sort of a coherence effect from global consciousness around the world, that might cause some sort of a coherence for the output of whatever the random process was using in the random event generators or random number generators. But once you took that random process and crunched it with this additional process, that would destroy the basic randomness. And so what you'd have is some sort of a manufactured output that no longer reflected that initial coherence. So he said the only way that this could actually be working is if Roger or some other experimenter, if their intention were then driving the random number generators such that he wanted to see a particular output. And so that output then was, even through this process of being crunched, ended up giving him the effect that he wanted to see. So I don't know if my explanation made sense to you.
So to be clear, we're still talking about a psi effect here, but it's not the classical interpretation. And yeah, I suppose this is crediting Roger's mind with more power than maybe he'd be happy to admit. How have you? How has Roger responded to these criticisms? Does he agree with these interpretations?
I have spoken to him about it. He disagrees with it, and so there have been a series of little debates between Peter and Roger in the press. One was in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, another was in the journal Explore, and so they're going back and forth to say, no, this looks like an experimenter effect, or it doesn't look like an experimenter effect because it has other characteristics. So this has been going on. As you say, either way, it's a psi effect. It's either a psi effect from Roger's consciousness or from sort of a global consciousness.
Could the reach of it go further than that? Could it be, for example, my expectation that that would be the sort of data that the Global Consciousness Project ought to create in the kind of retrospective sense?
So yes and no. You're saying that you as an observer, could you also retroactively be causing some sort of effect on this?
Yeah, and of course all
Helmut
of us.
Schmidt did some studies on this, and he did some fascinating studies. Well, here I'll describe one of his experiments.
Please.
So he took a random number generator and had it produce random clicks separated into either a left channel or a right channel, which were then played through headphones to a subject. The subject was then asked to use his or her intention to produce more clicks on the right side for a certain period of time and then more clicks on the left side for a certain period of time. And the subject was able to do this. So this was a somewhat conventional psychokinesis effect where the subject is affecting the random number generators to produce clicks as desired on the right or left. Then Helmut Schmidt did another series of experiments where he used this same type of random number generator to produce clicks on the left or right channel of a stereo tape. This is in the days of tape recorders. And so he recorded this. And so he recorded it for several known periods of time. Nobody listened when he was recording it to whether there were clicks on the left or right. It was simply recorded. He then made a duplicate of that tape, or those tapes, and stored them in a safe place. Then he had subjects play the tape and listen to clicks that were being produced by this stereo recording and see whether it was on the left or right channel. And the subjects had to, according to the protocol that they were told to follow, will there to be more clicks on the left or on the right. And they were able to do it again, just as well as they'd been able to do it when the clicks were being produced in real time.
So somehow their intention was reaching out across time as well as space and having some kind of influence on the output of that system as it had ran in the past.
Right, and we can go into more depth as to how that works, and here we will get quantum mechanical. In addition to what the experiment I just described, Helmut Schmidt then went and looked at the tapes that had been stored that were copies of the original. And he found that those tapes that had been stored also showed the same sequences of more clicks on the left or more clicks on the right when in response to the subject's desire. So apparently the subject retrocausally changed not only the tape that he or she was listening to, but also the copy of it.
That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. So you asked the question with the Global Consciousness Project as to whether you, as an observer of the data later, might have an effect on it. So what Helmut Schmidt did is he extended this experiment to have different people look at the recordings at different times. And what he found was the first person who examined the recording. So for example, the subject who listened to it and willed clicks to be on the left or right was the person who had the most dramatic effect on this pre-recorded set of clicks. Subsequent examinations by other people had less or zero effect on the recordings. So if we then take a look at the Global Consciousness Project and ask who would be having the most effect on it, presumably, if there is an experimenter effect, it's the first people who are looking at the data. And so you and I, looking at the data after it's been published and so on, are likely to have a negligible effect on the data.
And so the comparison here with quantum mechanics is that when we observe or measure a system, we not only resolve the state of the system in that moment, but we also define how it behaved at previous junctions. And so there's this facet of quantum mechanics where we are, in some sense, resolving events as they occurred in the past.
Right. Let me put it a different way. When you have a quantum mechanical event occurring at some random time or so involving some sort of a random process, and the classical case for this is Schrödinger's cat. But when you have that sort of a quantum mechanical process, usually the result exists in a superposition of states. It is not defined, but instead you have all the different possibilities of the outcome for a particular process. And those possibilities all exist at once. Then, at some point, when the event takes place or when it's observed, those different superposition of states, in the vernacular, there's a collapse of the wave function. So those particular states end up with a single result. So in looking at these experiments that Helmut Schmidt did with the pre-recorded clicks, you could say, in one sense, that those pre-recorded clicks were manipulated backwards in time by the person listening to them subsequently. Or you could say that those recordings existed in a superposition of different states, and so the person listening to them subsequently was not really reaching back in time, but was affecting instead that superposition of states as they existed in real time when he or she was listening to them. And it's indistinguishable. You cannot tell the difference between reaching back in time or affecting a superposition now.
So, I mean, let's say that there's this effect, there's a relationship between mind and world, which is being shown in these experiments, and maybe it's a different interpretation to the standard one, but where does that lead you in thinking about the place of mind in the world? Is it a reflection of something that's fundamental in some way? Because it seems to me that for a mental intention to have any kind of causal currency in the world, for there to be this psychological correspondence, it seems to necessitate that the world itself has a kind of mental aspect. Is this a form of idealism or panpsychism that's being sort of subtly proposed with this theory?
So for years, I really didn't like what you just said. I came from a traditional physics background, and I was very much a materialist. And my initial psi work in theory and experiment was aimed to show how these psi phenomena could be explained through some sort of a physical process, perhaps not a conventional physical process, but something that was materialistic in origin.
Perhaps information or something.
Perhaps information. And so, for example, one experiment that I carried out involved using two electronic random number generators. And in order to explain this experiment, I need to describe first an earlier experiment carried out by some prominent researchers in the field.
Go for it.
So, two researchers, Spottiswoode and May, carried out an experiment in which they took a subject and put a loud electronic horn facing this subject. They then had an electronic random number generator determine when this horn would sound at random times. And as you can imagine, the subject was quite irritated when the horn did sound. The subject was also hooked up to a computer using various sorts of measures, one of the main ones being a galvanic skin response measure. And so that consists of two conducting pads that are placed on the skin of the subject, and they measure a change in the conductivity of the skin. And it turns out that the conductivity of the skin varies very quickly in fractions of a second when we're under some sort of emotional stress. Probably it's something having to do with sweat glands emitting some moisture very quickly. And as you would expect, when the horn went off, the galvanic skin response of these subjects went haywire because they were emotionally stimulated by the horn.
Right.
However, if you looked carefully, you would then see that the response, the galvanic skin response, started a couple of seconds before the horn went off, even though the horn went off at random times. And when the horn didn't go off, there was no pre-response.
And the person wasn't consciously aware that the horn was about to go off before it did, but somehow their physiological arousal was responding in advance.
That's right, exactly. And this was a fairly robust experiment. It's been carried out now by different researchers a number of different times. There are different interpretations of it, but no matter how you interpret it, the fact is that there was a galvanic skin response in advance of what appears to be a random sounding of the horn.
Extraordinary.
So for years, as I mentioned, I didn't like the idea of psi being this consciousness effect, and it sounded a little bit too woo-woo and new agey to me. And so finally it occurred to me how I could test this in a non-human system. And so I commissioned Celeron, which is a company that makes electronic random number generators, to make for me a particular system. And the system consists of two electronic random number generators. One I'll call the controller, and the second one, the subject. And so the controller random number generator would, at a random time, turn off the subject random number generator. All the while this was happening, the output of the subject random number generator would be recorded by a computer. And what I wanted to do was replicate something like this experiment of Spottiswoode and May and see not whether the subject could anticipate a horn going off, but in this case, whether the subject random number generator could anticipate its own demise, and whether the bits that it was spewing out would deviate from randomness a few seconds before it was shut off. So we set this up. A grad student of mine, James Zhu, did a lot of work on the software, and he was very good at this and very rigorous. And I remember the first set of 300 trials. The nice thing about this system is that it can just run day and night and give out as much data as you want. It doesn't get tired the way that humans would. Mm-hmm. And the first set of 300 trials were mind-blowing. They showed a strong deviation from randomness about 1 second before the subject random number generator was shut off.
So just prior to one of the REGs, which was being controlled by the other one, just prior to it being turned off, it had a stress response of some description?
Yeah, that's one way of describing it. It had a stress response. And wow. It normally in these psychokinesis effects, the effects are fairly small. You see one part change in 10,000, so part in 10 to the 4. And if you do enough statistics, if you do it often enough, you'll see a statistically significant psychokinesis effect. In our studies, we had an effect size that was 1 in 40. So it was huge. So we got really excited. I remember not sleeping that night. I was just thinking that I've finally been able to get rid of these sentient bags of salt water and have a psi experiment that just uses electronic random number generators.
And the effect is huge.
And the effect was huge. And I thought, okay, not only is this going to be good for explaining what's happening in these and doing some good science, but also we can use this. For example, if you can anticipate something a second before it's going to happen, just imagine playing the stock market using this or anything.
Yeah.
So we ran it more times, 1,000 times, and the effect just continued. And odds against chance were humongous. They were astronomical.
And just to be clear, both of the REGs are shielded from all kinds of ordinary environmental stimulus.
Totally
There's
shielded.
No electrical surges.
No. And in fact, to begin with, we wanted to try to use an electromagnetic pulse rather than shutting off the electronic random number generator. We tried to use an electromagnetic pulse to affect it. But Celeron builds their devices too well, and they were just so well shielded we couldn't affect the output. Then also James went back and looked at his computer program, and just to make sure that we weren't fooling ourselves, he had the random number generator put out a timestamp for every bit that it sent out, so that we knew exactly when that bit was being sent out. And then the controller random number generator also put out a timestamp telling us exactly when it decided that it was going to shut off the electronic random number generator. And so we checked genuinely that this was some sort of a pre-sentient effect as opposed to being something where we were fooling ourselves. So then the next thing we did is we wanted to see whether this effect would remain robust even when we changed bit rates or we changed other things in the process. And so by changing these things, we found the effect went away. It didn't seem to like different bit rates. And so we explored this for a little while. And then finally, after about a couple of weeks, we said, okay, let's just run the initial experiment again as a sanity check. So using the identical software and the identical hardware, we reran the initial experiment, and there was no effect, no result. At that point, it dawned on me that what we were seeing was not the effect of one random number generator affecting another, but it was an experimenter effect. It was that James and I were so enthusiastic about this, and we really wanted to see an anticipatory effect in the random number generator, and so we did see it. And then later, when various psychological phenomena probably took place in our heads and our consciousnesses, we no longer saw that effect. Just to make a denouement here, I later had another student build his own random number generator and carry out the same experiment. And he too saw an effect that worked initially and then it declined and went away.
In correspondence to his enthusiasm and expectation of seeing an effect?
Presumably. I don't know. I'd like to connect this to the Global Consciousness Project and go somewhere with it, if I may.
Please.
If we look at the possible experimenter effect in the Global Consciousness Project, and we look at the evident experimenter effect that took place in my double random number generator experiment, I think there's a different way to interpret this. And that is something that I'm now calling cybotics, where the idea is to use psi to make a robot of a particular kind. So with the global consciousness experiment, I believe that Roger Nelson did effect it with his intention. But the effect is a very interesting and subtle one. He has affected it in the sense that he's programmed it to carry out the function that he wants. So, yes, Peter Bancel is correct that Roger Nelson's intention has affected these things, but I believe that Roger Nelson is also correct that it is measuring a global consciousness. He's programmed it, and he's now made it into a robot of sorts, which he programmed with his intention. Similarly, in the double random number generator experiment, I believe that the subject random number generator did, in fact, sense its own demise and anticipate it. Why? Because we, the experimenters, had programmed it to do that with our intention. And so this opens up the idea of using
myself today for second life replay. I killed myself today. I had too many lives, I did it to survive, so I killed myself today. But somehow I'm not dead, I'm still inside a head to justify what's real when truth is to believe. I killed myself today for second life replay. Yeah, I killed myself today. I killed myself